You know that one night that changes everything in your life? Well, mine began quietly, in the dim glow of my kitchen light. The kind of night where the wind whispers secrets through the cracks in the windows and even the shadows seem to lean closer. I was 23, barely married, and still dreaming of a future filled with ordinary joys, the kind that seemed endless at the time. But that night, a message arrived that would shatter the fragile peace of my life and force me to confront a darkness I had never imagined. It started innocently, almost like a forgotten text from a friend, except there was no name attached. I stared at the phone, my fingers trembling slightly as I read the words. "They're coming tomorrow. They will try to convince you that you're imagining things. Don't eat or drink what they offer." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight I could not explain. A chill ran down my spine. My husband sat in the living room, reading the evening paper, completely oblivious to the storm brewing in my hands. I tried to dismiss it at first. Perhaps it was a joke or some strange phishing scam. But deep inside, I felt an instinctive pull, a premonition that this was something far more serious. I couldn't ignore it. I folded the phone and kept it close to my chest as if it were a lifeline. I had no idea yet who was sending these messages or how they could possibly know what was going to happen. But I knew somehow that I had to listen. The next morning arrived with an almost cruel normalcy. The sun rose over the small town, spilling warm light over the streets. Birds chirped as if unaware of the human treacheries that would unfold, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery drifted through the air. Yet inside, I felt a tightening knot of dread. Charles and Henry were coming, and they were not alone. I heard the familiar crunch of tires on the gravel as a car pulled up outside. My heart began to race uncontrollably. Through the kitchen window, I saw Charles stepping out first, his smile warm and sugary, the very image of concern. Henry followed, holding a paper bag from the downtown bakery. And behind them, Jasmine, with her carefully crafted sweetness, trailed obediently. They had no idea, of course, that I already knew their intentions or at least suspected them. "Mom, we're so worried about you," Charles began in that infuriatingly gentle tone, the kind that pretended concern but hid every intention of manipulation. "The neighbors say you've been acting strange. Doris said you've been talking to yourself, and that you're not eating well." My lips pressed into a tight line. Doris had never said that, not once. That was just another layer of their carefully constructed lies, meant to erode my confidence and make me doubt myself. "And look," Henry added, lifting the bag of pastries, "Jasmine brought your favorite." His eyes, however, did not meet mine. They darted nervously, as if aware that their rehearsed performance might falter under scrutiny. "And we made coffee from that special brand you love so much," he added, forcing a false warmth into his voice. I remembered the warning from the message the night before. "Don't take anything they offer you to eat or drink." My pulse quickened. The thought hit me in a cold wave. They might plan to poison me too, just as they had done with Dad, Ernest. My hands shook slightly as I placed them on the edge of the counter. "Thank you," I said cautiously, "but I already had breakfast." Jasmine leaned forward, her smile fixed, her eyes betraying none of the warmth her voice claimed. "But Mom, you need to eat properly. You've lost a lot of weight since Dad passed." "I'm fine," I repeated firmly, taking a deliberate step back. Charles exchanged a glance with Henry, one that I instantly recognized from that same look they had shared at the hospital when the doctor delivered Ernest's prognosis. It was the look of calculation, of cold, strategic planning. "Mom," Charles continued, sliding into the chair beside me, "we need to talk about something important. Henry and I have consulted doctors about your recent behavior." "My behavior?" I echoed, incredulous. "Yes," Charles said, his tone laced with fox concern. "The strange questions you've been asking, the visits to the police station, your obsession with details about your father. It's normal to grieve, but it could be dangerous if left untreated." Henry nodded gravely. "We spoke to Dr. Albright. He says it's common for women your age to develop paranoia after losing a partner." "Paranoia," I whispered, tasting the word as if it were bitter poison itself. They were accusing me of imagining, of going mad, all because I dared to notice the inconsistencies in their stories. "I am not paranoid," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. though every nerve in my body screamed otherwise. I'm asking the questions I should have asked from the beginning. Charles leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. What questions? Why is there no police report for Dad's accident? Why is his shop perfectly clean if there was an explosion? Why did I withdraw $5,000 without knowing why? My voice gained strength with each word. The room fell silent. Charles and Henry exchanged fleeting glances of panic. A crack in their perfectly rehearsed mask. Mom, those things have simple explanations. Henry finally said, Dad wanted to surprise you with repairs. He hired workers secretly. That's all. If that were true, I challenged, my hands trembling, where are the workers? Where are the materials? Why doesn't anyone in town know about this? Charles, flustered, tried again. Not all accidents need police reports, especially on private property. A lie, as Sergeant O'Connell would later confirm. Jasmine intervened, her voice saccharine yet patronizing. We just want to take care of you. That's why we thought a specialized care home would be best. The pieces fell into place. The complete plan, declare me incompetent, put me in a home, take control of my life and my money. First, they had murdered Ernest for insurance. Now this, and if I refuse? I asked, my voice steady despite the fear curling in my stomach. Charles's smile was thin, predatory. Then legal measures will be taken. You will get help, whether you want it or not. I needed time. I need to think, I said, buying a precious few moments of clarity. Of course, Jasmine cooed, but not too much time, for your own good. As they left, I sank into the kitchen chair, trembling from the surge of fear and rage. My sons, the blood of my blood, were plotting my ruin. That night, a message arrived, longer than the others. It was from Stephen Callahan, a private investigator my husband had hired 3 weeks before his death. They poisoned him with methanol. Tomorrow, meet me at the corner cafe at 3 p.m. For the first time since Ernest's death, I felt a spark of hope. The war had begun, and I had the truth on my side. Even as a 23-year-old young woman, married barely 3 months, I realized that the truth always finds a way, and now I was ready to fight. The morning sun had barely begun to pierce the light fog that hovered over Spring Creek when I noticed the familiar shapes of Charles and Henry's car rounding the corner. My pulse quickened. I had spent the night reviewing the messages from the mysterious sender, Stephen Callahan, going over every word, every warning. I knew that today could very well be the day I faced my son's true intentions. The weight of anticipation was almost unbearable. They arrived together, accompanied by Jasmine. Their carefully curated concern as apparent as their eagerness to execute whatever plan they had concocted. The sugary sweetness of their smiles, the exaggerated gestures, everything about their presence screamed rehearsed. Charles's hand lingered too long on the doorframe. Henry shifted uncomfortably, and Jasmine's eyes darted toward me as though to measure my reaction before speaking. Mom, you really need to eat something, Jasmine began, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt too heavy, too forced. She held a bag of pastries, and the smell of fresh bread wafted toward me, almost intoxicating. My stomach tightened at the thought of their potential danger. I remembered the warning, do not take anything they offer to eat or drink. I clutched my coffee cup like a shield and forced a calmness that belied the storm inside. I had breakfast, I said softly but firmly, keeping my distance. Charles leaned closer, his tone smooth, persuasive. We're concerned about you, Mom. You've been off since Dad's accident. We just want to help. He glanced at Henry, a silent signal passing between them. I had seen that look before. At the hospital, at the funeral, whenever they needed to coordinate a lie or manipulate someone. Henry nodded gravely. We've consulted with Dr. Albright. He said it's common after a loss for people to develop paranoia, especially older women. We want to make sure you're safe. I forced a laugh that came out hollow. Paranoia. That word burned in my mind. They were accusing me of imagining things, of losing my mind, simply because I had the audacity to question their lies. I am not paranoid, I said, keeping my voice level. I am asking questions I should have asked from the beginning. What questions? Charles asked, his patience thinning, a faint shadow crossing his carefully maintained mask of concern. Why is there no police report for Dad's supposed accident? Why is his shop spotless if there was an explosion? Why did I withdraw money from the joint account without explanation? My voice grew stronger with each word, as though stating the truth aloud could somehow anchor me amidst their manipulations. The room went silent. They exchanged looks of panic, thinly disguised. My suspicions had been correct. They were planning something, and their carefully crafted facade was beginning to crack. Mom, Henry finally said, those things have simple explanations. Dad wanted to surprise you with home repairs. He hired workers secretly, and that's all. I could feel my fingers clench involuntarily. If that were true, where are the workers? Where are the materials? Why has no one in town seen them? Charles faltered. Then tried another story. Not every work accident needs a report, especially on private property. Lies stacked upon lies. Every word, every gesture felt like a carefully aimed arrow, designed to pierce my confidence and make me doubt my perceptions. And that's why we think a specialized care home is the best option. Jasmine chimed in, her voice syrupy, as if the words alone could persuade me. It was all falling into place. Their plan to declare me mentally incompetent, isolate me, and seize control of my life and wealth. My husband had been taken from me, and now they wanted everything else. And if I refuse? I asked, my voice steady, though my heart pounded in my chest. Charles's smile was cruelly thin. Then we will have no choice but to proceed legally. Either way, you will get the help you need. I needed time to think, to plan, to survive. I need to consider it, I said, buying precious moments of clarity. Of course, Jasmine said sweetly, but not too much time, for your own good. As they left, the kitchen felt suffocating. I sank into a chair, my mind racing. My own sons, the very ones I had nurtured, loved, and sacrificed for, were capable of cold, calculated betrayal. They had killed Ernest for money, and now I was next in their eyes. That night, another message arrived, longer this time, from Stephen Callahan, my husband's private investigator. The words were simple but shocking. Meet me at the corner cafe tomorrow at 3 p.m. I have everything you need. Your sons are planning more than you imagine. For the first time since Ernest's death, a small flame of hope flickered within me. I wasn't alone. The truth had allies. And now I would have the chance to fight back. The war had begun, and I was ready. The next morning dawned cold and gray, a mirror of the unease that clung to me. I barely slept, my mind spinning with thoughts of the previous day's confrontation. Charles and Henry's false concern had only made the danger more tangible. Every movement I made, every glance at the window, reminded me that I could not trust anyone, not even those who shared my blood. By mid-morning, I arrived at the corner cafe. The small bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, and the aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods momentarily soothed my tension. I moved toward the back table, my eyes scanning every corner for signs of surveillance, for the smallest hint that someone was watching me. I was cautious but determined. My husband had trusted me to continue his fight. I would not fail him. At exactly 3 o'clock, a man in his 50s approached, carrying a brown leather folder under his arm. He was tall, with a composed demeanor, gray hair brushed back, and eyes that radiated intelligence and calm determination. Mrs. Hayes, he asked softly. I nodded. Yes, are you? Stephen Callahan. He smiled faintly, a professional yet reassuring gesture. I'm here to help you. I'm sorry for your loss. Your husband Ernest was a remarkable man, and he foresaw danger before it struck. That is why he hired me. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Did he know what my sons were planning? I asked quietly, gripping my handbag. Not exactly, Stephen replied, settling into the chair opposite me, but he suspected there was a threat. He couldn't know every detail, but he wanted proof, documentation, and a plan in place just in case. That's why he entrusted me with this mission. He opened the folder and pulled out a small voice recorder. I have recordings of your sons plotting Ernest's murder. And there's more. We also have photographs, bank documents, and medical records that prove the murder and their intentions toward you. My chest tightened. The weight of months of fear, suspicion, and grief pressed down on me. Please, show me, I whispered, my voice trembling but resolute. Steven pressed play. Ernest's voice filled the small space, calm but filled with apprehension. Steven, if something happens to me, you must ensure Margot knows the truth. Charles and Henry are planning something dangerous. I've increased the life insurance, but I fear they will not stop at mere greed. Watch over her, protect her, document everything. I pressed my hands to my face, tears sliding down my cheeks. Hearing Ernest's voice, so familiar and loving, was like holding a piece of him again. But the words confirmed my worst fears. My sons had plotted their father's death. Steven continued, showing me photographs. One image captured Charles leaving a hardware store with a small bottle in hand. Another documented financial records, large debts, unexplained withdrawals, and evidence of desperate spending far beyond their means. It all added up: greed, desperation, and a ruthless disregard for human life. They poisoned him with methanol in his coffee, Steven explained, disguised as a vitamin supplement. The symptoms mimic a heart attack or stroke, which is why the doctors didn't suspect foul play at first. My world spun. The very men I had raised, nurtured, and loved had committed one of the most unthinkable betrayals. Not only had they murdered Ernest, but they were already planning the same for me. There's one more recording, Steven said, lowering his voice. He pressed play, and the chilling conversation began. Once we have Dad's insurance money, we need to get rid of Mom too. We can make it look like a suicide from grief. Then all the money and the house will be ours. I felt as though the room had grown colder. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. I had known my sons could be selfish, but not capable of something so monstrous. Not the boys I had comforted at night. The children I had held when they cried. Those sons were gone, replaced by monsters driven by greed. Steven leaned forward, urgency in his eyes. We cannot wait. They are planning to have you declared mentally incompetent tomorrow. If that happens, the legal system could tie our hands. We need to go to the police tonight, present all evidence, and make sure your sons face justice. I nodded, my resolve hardening. Ernest had given me the tools, and now I had the chance to wield them. We act tonight, I said firmly. We will not allow them to hurt me or anyone else. That evening, we went directly to the police station. The night was quiet, almost eerily so, as if the town itself sensed the approaching storm. Sergeant O'Connell was on duty, his steady presence immediately calming my nerves. I handed him Steven's folder, and we began to lay out every piece of evidence, the audio recordings, photographs, bank statements, and medical reports. For hours we documented every detail. The police took notes meticulously, verifying everything. By midnight, warrants were prepared, and the arrest scheduled for dawn. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of peace. I was no longer defenseless. Ernest had not died in vain. His foresight had given me a chance to fight back. As I walked home that night, the chill of the autumn wind could not penetrate the warmth that spread through me. Justice, though delayed, was within reach, and I would see it delivered with the truth as my shield and Ernest's memory as my guiding light. Dawn broke cold and pale over Spring Creek, the sky painted in muted shades of gray that matched the tension in my chest. I watched from the window, my hands gripping the sill, as several police cars rolled silently toward Charles and Henry's homes. The flashing lights reflected off the wet pavement, and my stomach twisted with a mix of fear, relief, and anticipation. The men who had once been my sons, the very men who had murdered Ernest, were about to face the consequences of their actions. My phone buzzed relentlessly. Charles called first, his voice a mix of panic and false calm. Mom, please, where are you? You need to come now. I didn't answer. Moments later, Henry called, his tone equally desperate, bordering on hysteria. I remained silent, knowing that engaging them would only fuel their delusions and give them an advantage. I was no longer a victim. I was a force they could not manipulate. At precisely 9 o'clock, there was a firm knock on my door. Sergeant O'Connell's presence brought a strange sense of security. Mrs. Hayes, he said gently but firmly, "We've arrested Charles and Henry. They are now in police custody, charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder." Relief washed over me, though my legs trembled with residual fear. "How did they react?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Charles denied everything at first, as expected," the sergeant replied. "But when we presented the recordings, his composure crumbled. He finally understood the weight of his actions. Henry, on the other hand, attempted to flee through a back window. We had to chase him for 6 blocks before taking him into custody. The audacity and recklessness of my sons, once my pride, now revealed as their tragic flaws, stunned me. I couldn't help but feel a bittersweet sorrow. The boys I had raised were gone, replaced by men consumed by greed and cruelty. By afternoon, Jasmine arrived, sobbing, a fragile shadow of the calculating woman I had once known. "Mrs. Hayes," she pleaded, "please, you have to drop the charges against Charles. He's not bad. He was just desperate because of his debts. This is my fault too. I pressured him to find money. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I looked at her without a flicker of compassion. "Jasmine," I said, my voice cold but calm, "your husband poisoned my husband, and they were planning to kill me as well. There is no excuse for that. There is no redemption. Leave my house." She hesitated, screaming in desperation, but I did not waver. That day marked a turning point, not only for justice but for my own liberation from the chains of fear and betrayal. 3 days later, the exhumation of Ernest's body confirmed the worst: the presence of lethal levels of methanol in his system. The forensic evidence was irrefutable. The town was shocked. Newspapers ran headlines declaring it the cruelest crime of the decade, a scandal that shook the community to its core. People who had once smiled at my sons now stared in disbelief at the depth of their treachery. The investigation uncovered more truths. Charles had debts totaling $70,000 to illegal lenders who had threatened him with violence. Henry owed $40,000 to underground gambling rings. Their desperation had transformed into premeditated murder. Even the doctor who falsified Ernest's death certificate had received a $5,000 bribe and was arrested for obstructing justice and falsifying official documents. Stephen Callahan had orchestrated the investigation with meticulous care. Every recording, every photograph, every piece of evidence had been documented with precision. Ernest had been clever, and even in his final days, he had ensured the tools of justice were in place. His foresight, combined with Steven's diligence, left no room for escape. By evening, I returned home, exhausted but fortified. I walked through the rooms, once haunted by grief, now filled with a sense of purpose. Ernest's shop, silent for months, stood as a symbol of what had been lost, yet it was also a promise of what could be restored. Justice was coming, and with it, a path to healing. Even as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I felt a strange sense of serenity. The storm of betrayal had passed, and although the wounds ran deep, the truth had emerged victorious. My sons were no longer threats. They were captives of their own choices, and their punishment had begun. The trial began 2 months after the arrests, and the tension in Spring Creek was palpable. Word had spread quickly, and the courthouse was packed from morning until night. Reporters from every major regional newspaper had arrived, eager to capture what was already being called the case of the killer's sons. Neighbors, former co-workers of Ernest, and even strangers curious about the scandal filled every seat. I wore my best black dress, the one I had saved for significant occasions, now transformed into a symbol of mourning, dignity, and resilience. Stephen Callahan sat beside me, a steady presence in the storm, reminding me that I was no longer alone in this fight for justice. Charles and Henry were led into the courtroom in handcuffs, dressed in orange prison jumpsuits. Seeing them there, stripped of all pretense, stirred a mixture of grief and anger within me. These men, once my sons, had become monsters, and I knew the innocence that had once existed in them was gone forever. The prosecutor began the opening statement with calm authority, presenting the case as one of deliberate, cold-blooded premeditation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "this is not a story of simple family tragedy. This is a story of greed, deception, and betrayal. The defendants Charles and Henry Hayes murdered their father in cold blood and plotted to murder their own mother, motivated solely by financial desperation and self-interest. As the evidence unfolded, the courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. One by one, the recordings were played. First, the conversations plotting Ernest's murder, Charles and Henry discussing methanol, the supposed vitamin supplement, the step-by-step plan to make it look like a heart attack. Each playback was a blow to the heart, a confirmation of the betrayal that had been carefully documented. When the recording of their plan to kill me was played, a collective gasp echoed through the room. Several elderly women left crying. A man in the back shook his head in disbelief. I held myself steady, gripping the edge of my seat, my eyes fixed on the defense table. The defense lawyers tried to cast doubt, suggesting desperation, external influence, and emotional instability. They attempted to paint Charles and Henry as victims of circumstance, but the evidence was irrefutable. Bank statements showed unauthorized withdrawals. Photographs captured Charles purchasing methanol under a false name. The exhumation confirmed the lethal presence of the poison, and the recordings, they spoke louder than any lawyer ever could. When it came time for me to testify, my legs trembled as I walked to the stand. The room seemed impossibly large, every eye fixed on me, yet my mind was clear. Mrs. Hayes, the prosecutor began, can you describe your relationship with your sons before these events? I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. I believed I had a good relationship with them. I raised them with love, sacrifice, and devotion. Their father and I worked tirelessly to give them every opportunity. I never imagined that same love would become the reason for their betrayal and my husband's murder. I recounted how I had trusted them completely, how I had believed their lies about the accident, the funeral, and the sudden purchases. Every detail that now seemed suspicious had appeared normal at the time. I told the courtroom about the messages, the private investigator, the recordings, and the painstaking work of Ernest and Steven to ensure that justice would be possible. Charles avoided my gaze. His head bowed, while Henry stared defiantly but betrayed a glimmer of guilt in the tear-filled corners of his eyes. The prosecutor then played the full recording of their plan to murder me. I watched as faces in the audience twisted in horror. This was the moment when the extent of their cruelty became undeniable. I felt no fear. Instead, I felt a quiet strength, the satisfaction of knowing that truth, at last, had a voice. The medical examiner presented his testimony with calm authority. He explained how methanol acts slowly, mimicking the symptoms of a heart attack or stroke. He detailed Ernest's perfect health before the poisoning, connecting every symptom, every evidence point to deliberate murder. Steven testified in meticulous detail, describing the installation of listening devices, the gathering of photographs, and the careful documentation of the son's plotting. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place before the jury. After 3 days of intense testimony, the closing arguments arrived. The prosecutor's words were decisive, painting Charles and Henry not as misguided children but as calculated predators. These men, he said, saw their parents as obstacles. They planned, executed, and covered up a murder. They are not victims of circumstance. They are criminals who must face the full weight of justice. The jury deliberated for 6 long hours. The minutes stretched endlessly as the courtroom waited, the air thick with tension. When they finally returned, the silence was absolute. The judge read the verdict: guilty on all counts, first-degree murder of Ernest Hayes and conspiracy to commit murder against Margot Hayes. The courtroom erupted in whispers, murmurs, and shocked exclamations. Charles slumped in his chair, finally confronting the gravity of his actions. Henry remained stoic, his face frozen in disbelief. When the judge pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 30 years, the weight of justice settled over the room. For the first time since Ernest's death, I felt a surge of peace. Justice had been served, not just for him, but for myself and for the truth we had fought so hard to protect. The courtroom emptied, but I remained a moment longer, absorbing the relief and quiet triumph that had seemed impossible just months before. The trial's conclusion brought with it an odd sense of calm. For months, the chaos of betrayal, murder, and planning had consumed every waking moment of my life. But now, as the courtroom emptied and the echoes of the judge's gavel faded, I realized that the weight pressing on my chest had lifted, ever so slightly. Justice had been served, yet the pain of losing Ernest and the knowledge of what my sons had become remained a permanent scar. Steven walked me home after the trial. His presence was steadying, his support unwavering. "How do you feel?" he asked gently. I looked at the familiar streets of Spring Creek, now seeming smaller and quieter than ever, and replied honestly, relieved but sad. Sad that the sons I raised were capable of such cruelty. Sad that Ernest is gone, but relieved that justice has been done. Returning to my home felt strange. The walls that had witnessed so much grief now seemed to breathe again. The place was no longer just a home. It was a sanctuary where I could finally begin to heal. For the first time since Ernest's death, I could imagine living without the constant shadow of fear hanging over me. The house, with its soft yellow walls and sunlight streaming through the windows, reminded me of the life Ernest and I had built together. Before greed and murder had infiltrated our family, 3 days after the trial, the exhumation of Ernest's body took place. The laboratory results confirmed everything we had already known. Lethal levels of methanol coursed through his system, the undeniable proof of a life stolen too soon. The evidence shocked the community, and the newspapers ran headlines describing the Hayes case as the cruelest family crime of the decade. Neighbors whispered as they passed me on the streets, and while some offered pity, others offered respect. I held my head high, knowing the truth was on my side. In the weeks that followed, more details emerged. Charles had owed $70,000 to illegal lenders, while Henry's gambling debts amounted to $40,000. Their financial desperation had blinded them, transforming once loyal sons into calculating murderers. Even the doctor who falsified Ernest's death certificate had been arrested for obstruction of justice and document falsification after evidence revealed he had accepted a $5,000 bribe. The full scope of their crimes was finally exposed, leaving no doubt in anyone's mind of their guilt. The days after the trial were quiet, almost surreal. I spent hours sitting on the porch, remembering Ernest, remembering the life we had shared, and the love that had sustained me through decades. Steven visited regularly, helping me sort through evidence, photographs, and letters. He became more than just an investigator. He became a friend, a confidant, someone who reminded me that even after betrayal, human kindness still existed. I began transforming Ernest's shop into a garden, a living tribute to his memory. I planted red roses, white carnations, and sunflowers, flowers that symbolized love, purity, and hope. Each Sunday, I would pick fresh flowers and take them to his grave, speaking to him about the small victories and quiet joys that now filled my life. His headstone, engraved with the words "beloved husband, betrayed father, honorable man," became my sanctuary. I spoke to him as if he were still beside me, telling him about the foundation we had created, the families we were helping, and the justice that had finally prevailed. Jasmine disappeared soon after the trial. Rumor had it she had moved to a distant city and changed her name. I did not seek answers or closure from her. The past belonged to memory, and the present demanded my attention. Life, I realized, was not about vengeance. It was about survival, healing, and creating meaning from tragedy. Charles's suicide in prison and Henry's subsequent mental breakdown were grim reminders of the consequences of their choices. While I did not feel joy at their suffering, I did recognize that the world had restored a measure of balance. Life had a way of correcting itself, even when human actions had caused irreparable harm. Through all of this, I discovered the power of resilience. I realized that true family was not defined by blood, but by love, loyalty, and respect. Ernest had been my true family, my companion in life and love, and together we had created something beautiful even in the face of cruelty. Steven and the friends who supported me became my chosen family, a network of trust, care, and understanding. Evenings became my favorite time. I would sit in Ernest's garden, tending to the flowers and reflecting on the lessons I had learned. I had survived betrayal, murder, and the worst that greed could offer. I had reclaimed my life, and in doing so I had found a new purpose. The foundation we created with Ernest's life insurance money became a beacon for other families, offering psychological support, legal guidance, and hope. Each family we helped was a testament to the courage and perseverance that can emerge from tragedy. The pain had not disappeared, nor had the memories, but they had transformed. They became lessons, reminders of the strength that resides in truth, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring power of love even after loss. The quiet moments on the porch, the laughter of neighbors visiting the garden, and the letters from families helped me realize that my life, though scarred, was full of meaning once again. The weeks following the trial were quiet, but they were also filled with purpose. Each morning, I rose early to tend to the garden where Ernest's shop had once stood. The red roses, white carnations, and golden sunflowers were no longer just plants, they were symbols of resilience, hope, and the life we had built together. Every seed I planted reminded me that even after devastation, new beginnings were possible. The earth in my hands was tangible proof that life could grow again, even after betrayal and death. Steven visited me every Wednesday, and our routine became a comforting rhythm. We drank coffee on the porch while sharing stories about his other investigations, about families who had faced dangers similar to mine. He was no longer just an investigator or a friend. He had become my chosen family, a constant reminder that support and love could exist outside of bloodlines. I shared my thoughts about the foundation with him, our shared dream of turning tragedy into hope. Each week, we planned new programs, organized workshops, and strategized ways to reach families who were silently suffering. The Ernest Hayes Foundation for victims of family crimes quickly grew beyond my expectations. Families who had endured similar tragedies began to reach out, seeking guidance, legal advice, and emotional support. We connected them with psychologists, lawyers, and investigators who could ensure that justice was not just a possibility but a reality. Each success story, each family that found closure, filled me with a sense of purpose I had never felt before. My grief became a driving force to help others avoid the suffering I had endured. 6 months after the foundation's launch, a young woman named Eleanor came to see me. She suspected that her brother had murdered their mother for the inheritance, a scenario painfully reminiscent of my own story. Eleanor's eyes were filled with fear, but also with the determination to find the truth. I listened carefully, offering advice, emotional support, and the resources of the foundation. We connected her with a private investigator, provided legal counsel, and ensured she had the psychological help she needed to face her brother. When justice was served 3 months later, Eleanor returned to hug me, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Hayes, you saved my life. If you hadn't had the courage to report your own sons, I never would have found the strength to report mine," she said in that moment. I understood that every tear I had shed, every night I had spent trembling in fear, had led to a greater purpose. Meanwhile, life continued around me in small, comforting ways. I maintained my routines, baking, tending to the garden, and walking the streets of Spring Creek. Neighbors greeted me with warmth and respect, some bringing flowers or small tokens of appreciation for the work I had done with the foundation. Steven often joined me in these walks, sharing stories and helping me remember that despite the past, life still offered beauty and companionship. Charles's suicide and Henry's institutionalization served as grim reminders of the consequences of unchecked greed. Though I felt no pleasure in their suffering, I understood that their actions had led them to a point of no return. Reading Henry's sporadic letters became an exercise in detachment. I could no longer seek answers or closure from the sons they had once been. I had to protect my peace, and I did so by keeping their letters unopened, stored safely in a showbox, a tangible boundary between my past and my present. Jasmine disappeared from town shortly after the trial, leaving only whispers and rumors in her wake. I did not dwell on her choices or question her motives. The past, I realized, belonged to memory, and I had no power to change it. Instead, I focused on the present, nurturing the life I had rebuilt with my own hands. The garden, the foundation, and the friendships I had cultivated became my sanctuary. They reminded me daily that while betrayal and loss had shaped me, they did not define me. The foundation flourished. We began receiving letters from families across the country, all sharing stories of grief, betrayal, and the need for justice. Each story became a mission, a reason to expand our programs and ensure that no family had to suffer in silence. Workshops on recognizing warning signs of familial exploitation, seminars on legal protections, and psychological support groups became regular features of our work. I was no longer just a widow who had survived tragedy. I had become an advocate, a mentor, and a beacon of hope for others who had faced unspeakable losses through it all. My connection to Ernest remained unbroken. Each Sunday, I would visit his grave, speaking to him about the progress of the foundation, the families we had helped, and the personal victories I had achieved. I told him about the flowers in the garden, how they flourished under my care, a living testament to the life and love we had shared. I could almost feel his presence in the gentle rustle of leaves, the warmth of sunlight on my face, and the quiet peace that had settled over my home. Evenings became a time of reflection and gratitude. I would sit on the porch with Steven, watching the sky change colors as the sun set over Spring Creek. We talked about everything: our dreams, our losses, and the lives we had touched through our work. I allowed myself to feel joy again, not just the fleeting happiness that follows justice, but the deep, sustaining contentment of having found purpose in life after tragedy. The foundation and the garden became intertwined with the story of my life. They were symbols of resilience, evidence that even in the darkest times, hope could take root. Every family helped, every story heard, every injustice corrected was a reminder that pain could be transformed into positive action. I had taken the tragedy of Ernest's murder and turned it into a force for good, a legacy that would outlive both my grief and my son's betrayal. With the foundation established and the garden thriving, life began to settle into a rhythm that I had not known since Ernest's death. Each day was a careful balance of reflection, action, and quiet healing. Mornings started with tending to the flowers, watering the sunflowers and pruning the roses, the same ones Ernest had loved so much. The act of caring for life became almost meditative. It was a tangible way to honor the memory of my husband and to remind myself that love, unlike betrayal, could grow stronger over time. Steven continued his weekly visits, and his presence became a grounding force in my life. We often spent hours on the porch, sharing stories about his past investigations, the families he had helped, and the challenges he faced as a private investigator. More than a colleague or friend, he had become family, someone I could rely on without fear of betrayal. Our conversations were full of laughter, advice, and sometimes tears, but they always ended with a sense of purpose and clarity. I realized that human connection, built on trust and honesty, could heal wounds that no medicine ever could. Through the foundation, we began receiving letters from people who had suffered similar tragedies. Each story reminded me that I was not alone in my pain and that the betrayal I endured had broader implications. Families were struggling silently, unsure of how to act against loved ones who had crossed moral lines for greed or power. We provided them with legal counsel, psychological support, and investigative services. For many, our intervention prevented further tragedy, sometimes even saving lives. Each success was a small victory, a reminder that Ernest's death, though tragic, had not been in vain. One family in particular left a lasting impression on me. A woman named Eleanor, 38, came to the foundation, desperate and fearful. She suspected her brother of having murdered their mother for inheritance money, mirroring the horrors I had faced. Her voice shook as she recounted her fears, and I could see the reflection of my younger self in her eyes. I guided her through the legal and emotional processes, connecting her with a trusted investigator and providing psychological support. 3 months later, after her brother was convicted, Eleanor returned to the foundation, tears streaming down her face. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "Mrs. Hayes, you saved my life. Without your courage, I never would have found the strength to stand up for justice." In that moment, I felt the weight of all my pain transform into something meaningful, something greater than my personal tragedy. Life outside the foundation also began to feel lighter. I returned to simple joys, baking bread in the morning, reading books on philosophy and history, and taking long walks through Spring Creek, the town. Once a place filled with suspicion and whispers, began to feel familiar and safe again. Neighbors would stop to chat, bringing small gifts from their gardens or inviting me to community events. It was a reminder that the world still contained kindness, even when personal betrayal had cut so deeply. Despite the calm, reminders of the past remained. Henry, confined to a psychiatric hospital after Charles's suicide, occasionally sent letters. They were incoherent, fragmented cries of guilt and despair. At first, I read them with the faint hope of finding the sons I once knew, but I soon realized that the people they had been were gone. I chose to keep the letters unopened, a conscious act of protecting my peace. Some might have called it cold, but I knew it was necessary. Healing required boundaries, and I had earned the right to safeguard my emotional well-being. Jasmine, too, disappeared from our town, her name erased from our daily lives. Whether she had known the full extent of Charles's plans, or was merely a bystander swept into greed, mattered little now. The past belonged to memory and justice, not to active engagement. I focused on the present, cultivating relationships, nurturing the garden, and expanding the reach of the foundation. Each day became a testament to resilience and a reminder that life, even after betrayal, could hold beauty and purpose. Sundays were sacred. I would walk to Ernest's grave, carrying fresh flowers from the garden, speaking to him about the foundation's progress, the families we had helped, and the small personal victories I had achieved. In these moments, I could almost feel him beside me, listening with the gentle patience that had always defined his presence. His love, unbroken by death, became a source of comfort and guidance, reminding me that even in loss, connections endured. As the foundation grew, we were able to host workshops, seminars, and support groups for families experiencing betrayal and financial exploitation. I often stood before groups of anxious or grieving individuals, sharing my story not for sympathy, but as proof that justice was possible. People would ask me how I had found the courage to report my own sons, and I would reply firmly, "Truth hurts, but lies kill the soul." Never let fear of betrayal stop you from seeking justice. These words, born from pain and reinforced by experience, became a beacon of hope for many. The garden and the foundation intertwined, creating a living testament to what could emerge from devastation. Red roses, golden sunflowers, and the laughter of families who had found resolution became symbols of resilience. I had taken the tragedy of Ernest's murder and turned it into something larger than myself, something that could prevent others from experiencing the same pain. The act of nurturing life, offering guidance, and advocating for justice became my way of honoring Ernest's memory. As the years passed, the story of what had happened to Ernest and our family became both a personal memory and a public lesson. I learned to embrace the idea that life continues, not in spite of tragedy, but because of how we choose to respond to it. Each morning, I would walk through the garden Ernest had loved, pausing at the sunflowers that always seemed to face the light. They reminded me that, no matter how dark a day may begin, life finds a way to reach toward hope. The same principle applied to human resilience. Even after betrayal, loss, and grief, it is possible to grow again. Steven continued his faithful visits every Wednesday. Over coffee on the porch, we discussed not only the foundation but also life itself, the small joys that many overlook, the quiet victories, and the importance of connection. He became more than a friend. He was family, the chosen family that filled the gap left by the sons who had betrayed me. His presence reminded me that loyalty, trust, and shared values are what truly define a bond. The laughs, the long conversations, and even the quiet moments of reflection gave me a sense of peace I had feared I would never feel again. The Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family Crimes grew beyond my expectations. Families from distant towns began seeking help. Each story mirrored parts of my own: greedy relatives, suspicious behavior, secret manipulations. I personally met with many of these families, offering guidance, emotional support, and connections to private investigators or legal counsel. Watching individuals regain control over their lives, find justice, or simply regain hope was profoundly fulfilling. Every letter of gratitude I received reminded me that Ernest's death had not been in vain. It became a source of purpose that transcended my personal grief. One woman, Eleanor, remains vivid in my memory. She came to the foundation in a state of fear and uncertainty, suspecting her brother had killed their mother for inheritance money. Her story echoed my own in frightening detail. I guided her through the investigative and legal process, connecting her with trusted professionals and helping her confront her fears. When her brother was convicted, Eleanor hugged me, sobbing. She whispered, "You saved my life. Without your courage, I could never have stood up for justice." That single moment encapsulated everything I had worked for: the transformation of personal tragedy into hope and protection for others. Even though Charles had taken his life in prison and Henry was confined to a psychiatric facility, letters occasionally arrived from him. At first, I read them, searching for traces of the boy I had once raised. But over time, I realized that reading them only reopened wounds that had already healed. I placed them carefully in a box and left them unopened, choosing to preserve my peace. The lessons learned from these letters were profound. Forgiveness is not always necessary for closure, and sometimes the most powerful form of self-care is to let go of the past. Jasmine disappeared from our town after the trial, reportedly moving to the city and changing her name. Whether she had been a silent accomplice to her husband's and Charles's schemes was irrelevant now. The past belonged to memory and justice, not to my daily life. I focused instead on cultivating relationships that nurtured growth, trust, and compassion. Every family I helped, every flower I nurtured, every conversation I had with Steven became a reminder that life could be rebuilt with integrity, patience, and love. Sundays became sacred rituals. I walked to Ernest's grave, carrying fresh flowers from my garden, sharing updates about the foundation and the families we had helped. In those moments, I could almost feel him beside me, his presence a gentle reassurance that the work I was doing honored his memory. Speaking to him about the foundation, about justice, and about the growth of our community reminded me that love can transcend even death, leaving a legacy far greater than the sum of our grief. The town of Spring Creek would never forget the events that had unfolded. While some saw me as a hero and others whispered about my actions, I had long stopped seeking approval. What mattered was the truth and the peace that came from it. The local children grew up hearing the story of Ernest's murder as a cautionary tale, learning lessons about greed, betrayal, and the strength it takes to act righteously, even in the face of unimaginable pain. I had become a living example of courage, resilience, and moral clarity. In the evenings, when the sun cast long shadows across the garden, I often allowed myself to reflect on the children my sons had once been. Innocent, playful, full of potential. I mourned not only Ernest but also the lost possibilities of what they could have become. Yet, I no longer cried for the men they had become. They had chosen their path, a path that led to destruction, guilt, and sorrow. My tears were reserved now for the beauty of life that survived, for the growth and healing I had cultivated, and for the love that remained steadfast through it all. My story, once a private tragedy, had grown into a symbol of hope, justice, and resilience. It demonstrated that even the most profound betrayal cannot extinguish the human spirit, that love can be rebuilt, and that courage can transform grief into a force for good. Life continued in its quiet, deliberate rhythm. The garden flourished, the foundation grew, and I lived each day with gratitude, purpose, and a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible.
The years after the trial brought a quiet, reflective peace into my life. My home, once a place of grief and betrayal, had transformed into a sanctuary of memories, resilience, and purpose. The yellow walls of the living room, freshly painted in the soft hue Ernest had always loved, reflected the sunlight that streamed through the windows each morning, warming both the space and my spirit. The garden, now flourishing with roses, sunflowers, and carnations, became a daily reminder that life, even after devastation, could still bloom. Every petal, every bee visiting the flowers, felt like a gentle nod from Ernest, an acknowledgement that our love and our legacy had endured. Steven remained a constant presence in my life, bridging the gap left by the sons who had betrayed me. His visits on Wednesdays became our ritual. We shared coffee, stories, and sometimes just silence, appreciating the comfort of companionship without the weight of expectation or fear. He celebrated the victories of the foundation with me, and he mourned the small setbacks. Over the years, our bond grew beyond friendship into something resembling family, a chosen family built on trust, shared values, and mutual respect. His presence reminded me that one could find solace and loyalty even after immense betrayal. The Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family Crimes had become more than I ever imagined. What had started as a small, local effort to help families in Spring Creek evolved into a broader organization that supported dozens of families each year across the state. We provided legal aid, counseling, private investigations, and support groups, ensuring that no family endured in silence what I had suffered. Each letter of gratitude, each tearful embrace, each story of justice restored, reinforced the meaning of our work. Seeing people reclaim their lives, holding on to dignity and hope, reminded me of why it was so crucial to act, to confront evil with courage, and to seek truth without compromise. Even today, letters from Henry occasionally arrive. They are disjointed, filled with guilt and pleas for understanding. I do not read them. I place them in a box and let them remain there, a symbolic closure to a chapter of pain I no longer need to relive. I do not wish for revenge, nor do I wish for reconciliation. Peace comes not from reopening old wounds, but from acknowledging them and then choosing life, love, and justice over bitterness. Jasmine's disappearance from town after the trial also became a quiet chapter of closure. Whether she had known or suspected Charles's plans, or whether she had simply fled the shadow of guilt, it mattered little. I focused instead on what I could nurture: life, hope, and meaningful connections. Sundays remained sacred. I walked to Ernest's grave, carrying fresh flowers from the garden. Speaking to him aloud, I shared updates about the foundation, about families we had helped, and about life's small joys and victories. In those moments, I felt his presence, a quiet and unwavering support, as if he were there to reassure me that we had honored our love and that justice had been served. My grief had transformed into strength, my sorrow into action, and my loneliness into companionship with those who had chosen integrity, loyalty, and empathy. The story of our tragedy became a lesson for the town of Spring Creek and beyond. Parents spoke of it as a cautionary tale about greed, betrayal, and moral responsibility. Some called me a hero, others whispered that I had been cruel. I no longer sought the approval of the world. My measure of success was truth, peace, and the lives we had helped save. The foundation continued to grow, and its impact became a source of pride and purpose, a legacy that Ernest and I had created together, even after his life was taken in such a cruel manner. Evenings often found me in quiet reflection. I would look at photographs of Charles and Henry as children, innocent and playful, hugging their father, laughing during Christmas mornings, and marvel at the cruel twist that had led them away from that path. I mourned for what could have been, the joy, honor, and love that they had squandered. Yet, I no longer cried for the men they had become. Theirs was a story of greed and betrayal, mine was a story of endurance, justice, and redemption. I had chosen a path of integrity, and that choice brought a peace that no wealth, punishment, or vindication could replace. On special occasions, I would invite families from the foundation, friends, and even neighbors to celebrate Ernest's memory and the lives we had impacted. These gatherings were filled with laughter, shared stories, and the acknowledgement that tragedy can be transformed into hope. Stephen often gave speeches at these events, honoring both Ernest and the work we had accomplished together. The foundation had grown into a living memorial, a symbol that evil could be confronted, and that justice, though delayed, could prevail. As the years accumulated, I continued to live in the home Ernest and I had built, surrounded by memories of love, strength, and endurance. I cultivated the garden, tended to the flowers, and prepared meals with care, savoring the simple pleasures that reminded me that life, despite everything, was still worth living. I found joy in small routines, in acts of kindness, and in the satisfaction of seeing the foundation succeed. My health remained strong, fueled by purpose, and my heart, though scarred, was unburdened by fear. The story of Charles and Henry faded from the headlines, but never from memory. Occasionally, neighbors would ask me if I missed them. I did not. I missed the boys they had once been, not the men they chose to become. True family, I had learned, is not always determined by blood but by shared values, loyalty, and love that never turns to harm. Ernest had been my family for 42 years, and those who stood with me through justice, grief, and healing were my chosen family now. Each night, before sleep, I reflected on the journey we had endured. The lessons were clear: the truth, no matter how painful, must be sought. Justice must be pursued even when it seems impossible. Love requires boundaries, and betrayal does not have the power to destroy a spirit that refuses to surrender. As I looked at the stars from my porch, with the wind carrying the scent of roses from the garden, I felt Ernest's presence beside me, proud of the life we had built, the justice we had achieved, and the hope we had sown in the world. The story of our family tragedy, of greed, betrayal, and justice, had transformed into a narrative of resilience, hope, and purpose. I had endured the unthinkable, fought for truth, and created something lasting from the ashes of pain. Life continued, simple and authentic, guided by love, integrity, and the memory of a man whose death had inspired a force far greater than revenge. My life, now enriched with meaning and connection, was a testament that even in the face of darkness, courage, truth, and love can prevail.